Hey everyone, I'm Jay and welcome to the next in my series, Intro to HTML and CSS. Today's video we'll be talking about Chapter 6, which is all about page layout. We do have quite a lot of information in this chapter. Topics include the box model, which I do have a dedicated video about, but we'll cover it here anyway. Box sizing, which I talk about along with the box model, very joined topics. Normal flow, float, and clear, the two-column layout using unordered list for list navigations, pseudo-class, specifically the hover pseudo-class, and then positions. Okay. So we're starting off with the box model. Now, you've heard me say before that every element in our HTML page, every visible element, is going to be a box, right? And that box has some content. That box will have some padding. The padding could be set to 0, but it will have some padding. We'll have a border. Again, that could be set to 0 as well. And it will have a margin, which could also be set to 0. Right? But all of those things are part of that box. Some interesting things to note that when you set a background color, that background color will be behind the content. It will be behind the padding. I'm not sure if it will be behind the border. I have to check on that one. I have to run a test, but it's not behind the margin. Right? So if you want to set a background color, but you want some space either without the background color or with the background color, then you have to choose between the margin or the padding, whichever is appropriate for the box that you're trying to define. Okay. Let's see here. I've just covered all of these slides. Very good. Right? The margin is the very most outer one, okay? And the padding is the most inside one. And then the border lines up in between them. We do have some options for borders. We could have a solid border or a dotted border or a dashed border, right? But this takes us right into the box sizing. This is a CSS property that we can set, and we can define box sizing to be one of a couple different settings. We have either content box or border box. Content box is the default, which means that when you define the width of an element, you're actually just defining the width of the content, not the padding, not the border, and not the margin. Okay, just the content portion, which means that if you have an element with a padding and a border and a margin, and you define the width of it, you need to somehow figure out the width plus the padding plus the border in order for you to know what the overall width is. Okay? You can set it to border box though, however, and I have a link here, which I'll link below to Paul Irish's page. It's quite old now, but still very much relevant. If you set all of your elements to use border box, what that means is now when you set the width of the element, that width includes the content and the padding and the border as well. So if you make an element that has any amount of padding or any amount of border, you no longer have to do the math to add up the content, the padding, and the border to make sure that it fits within its parent. You still will have to do the math to figure out any margin if you have that set, but you take away these other, the border and the padding, you don't have to do the math for that. So very, very useful. Now we can have padding is very popular. We're going to have padding, maybe 1 EM of padding on 100% width element. If we set border box, we don't have to calculate what that is. If we have content box, the default set, now we have to say, okay, what's 100% minus 1 EM on either side? I don't know. We could use the calc function, but calc function was not in existence back in 2012 when Paul Irish originally wrote about this, and he had already had the problem for a while by then. Right? So border box is going to save us in that, and you'll see in most of the code that I will write, I will be setting border box using this same method. We set it to the HTML element, which is the parent of all the elements, and then we set all the other elements to inherit their box sizing from their parent, and the parent of everyone is the HTML element. So that means every element will be border box, and then if we ever need to change it, we can for individual elements. We always can do that. Right, this is the code that we'll use to set that. Right, we set the HTML to use border box, and then we set everything with an asterisk, including the before and the after, to be inherited. Moving on to now the normal flow, as we should know, hopefully, HTML is an interpreted language, so line by line, your browser is going to read each line and interpret it and then display something on the screen. So if you have, right here, I have a div followed by another div. The browser is going to display the first div, then it's going to display the second div. If I move the second div to be within the first div, line by line, the browser can still read it. It begins to draw the first one, draws the content of the first one, the text there, and then begins to draw the second one, draws its content, closes the second one, and then closes the first one. Now, both of these have some CSS, which I haven't shown here, but suffice to say they have a border and a background color and a size, right, a width and height. Okay, so that's the normal flow. Okay, clear hierarchical order, right? First comes this, then comes this. There's a parent-child relationship to know what goes inside of what. Very rigorous, right? Very easy for the browser to understand. When we have that normal flow, one of the first things that we'll learn about that break to some degree that normal flow is the float. Most commonly, this would be used for some sort of image that you want to push off to the side, but you want your text to automatically wrap around it. This is precisely what float is for. We tell the image to be floated either to the right or to the left, whichever you want. Okay, and then it will be floated. It's partially taken out of the normal flow, and it's in now kind of like a floated flow. It's still there. If other elements are floated, they will actually all kind of pile up alongside that one in line, and then if they run out of space horizontally, they'll pop down to the next line and they'll all begin piling up again. So that, and everything that's around it, paragraphs, for example, the text will wrap around it. If there are other elements like in H1, their text may begin to wrap around it, and it may also come down below it as well, as you'll see when you test this out. Okay, we have a couple of options to set for the float. First we can set it to none, right? Float none, which is the default, but if your element is inherited some sort of float, you can override it by setting float none. Or if you, somewhere in your CSS cascade, you've tripped something to be either left or right, you can set it to be none and override that. And then of course you can set it to be floated to the left or floated to the right, whichever part of the screen you would like it on. We can float more than just images though. We can float entire sections of our website. Okay, strictly speaking, in this example we have the sidebar floated left and the main content floated right. Once one of them is floated, we don't necessarily have to float the other one. It is an easier thing to do. You can just say one's floated to the left and one's floated to the right, and then you decide how wide each one is. But once one is floated either to the left or the right, the other one could be just positioned alongside of it, given its proper width and its proper margins and everything else. It's not a requirement that they both be floated. However, it is fairly easy to do it this way. Okay. Note that if you do have a series of floated elements, they are all going to float and kind of pile up in a line, in a horizontal line, until they run out of space. And then it's going to, if you still have more elements, you're going to pop down to the next line and just keep floating and keep doing a whole bunch of space. If you have too many things that are floated and you want to control that float property, you can use clear to then tell an element, kind of like a child would when they're, or like everybody should when they're crossing the street, to look both ways. You can say that the clear is none, in which case it will just float as normal. You can say clear is both, and it will look both ways. See if it can see clearly all the way to the edge, all the way to the boundaries of its parent, if there are no floated elements there. If there is a floated element, that cleared element will move down until that element is finished and the path is clear, and it can go all the way. Now this element could still be floated. If you say an element is float left, but it's also clear left, it will float left, but it will make sure it is the leftmost element and it starts a new line. So you can clear just left or clear just right or clear both. Okay. Clearing both and then maybe alternating your elements to be float left and float right is maybe an interesting way to alternate things left and right, but leave space on the opposite side of either one of them. Okay. Now that we have the float and we have seen this two-column layout, let's talk about that just a little bit more. Here's a common two-column layout. We have the navigation on the left, could be on the right. This one's on the left. The main section taking up the rest of the space, and of course the header and footer at the top and bottom respectively. This is very easy to do with a float. We do have some things to consider when it comes to screen sizes, specifically if you have a responsive website that is, both responsive on the small mobile screens and then the larger desktop screens. The floats do require that we take that under consideration. We write different widths, and perhaps on the smaller screens we stop floating altogether because there's only so much width to work with, and putting things next to each other doesn't quite fit very often on the smaller screens. So we have a lot of things to consider there. However, it's totally doable. Has been done for ages now already. There are some more powerful methods that we'll talk about in a future chapter, but float is totally workable as long as you can take into consideration the screen size differences. Working on this float, now we have, we already know that we're using unordered lists for navigation, and normally the unordered lists will be the vertical bar right here that go into that sidebar that we've just created. But what if you also want a horizontal bar? Okay, the UL, the unordered list, doesn't go horizontally. However, we can use float to float all of the individual list items in that UL, and they will float all to the left. Okay. Take note though that if you want your horizontal navigation bar to be on the right hand side, they are going to be floated to the right, and they're going to be in a right to left reading decoration. So the first one is going to be all the way to the right, and the last one is going to be the last one. It's going to be to the left. Okay. Because that's the way the float goes. When you float right, the first one goes all the way to the right, the next one butts up to that, and then the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one, in a right to left fashion. So it can be difficult if you forget that and you just put your menu to the right, and now your menu has been reversed. Okay, so keep that in mind. Otherwise, everything works pretty much how you would expect it to. You just float them to the left, and then they all line up to the left. If you run out of space, they will automatically go down to the next line. It's quite convenient. Okay, assuming you're okay with having a second line, that is. Now that we've built a menu, you're going to want your users to hover over that menu and see a drop-down, perhaps, right? What we can do here, we have the pseudo-class, specifically the hover pseudo-class. And the way this works is that you can write however much CSS you want for an element, and in addition to that, you can write however much CSS you would like for what that element looks like when it's actively being hovered over by the user. And so this is how perhaps the vast majority of navigation bars are written. Right? You can have an unordered list within a list for the second tier of navigation, and you can set the default of that to be display none, and then when the parent gets hovered, now you can display the child again, and you can position it, which we will talk about, in order to get it to be exactly where you want it to be. Okay. Do note though, with the hover on touchscreens, specifically mobile devices, the hover command works differently. It's a bit browser specific. Some of them will hover when they tap. They will trigger a hover for one frame and then it will stop. Some of them will trigger the hover and leave it on until something else is tapped. And then I think some of them will they won't have a hover at all. So this is browser dependent. I think a common one for the Chrome browser is when somebody taps, it will trigger the hover and it will stay on. Right? You will need to do some testing on your devices to see if that's the way that it works though. Alternatively, if this doesn't work, you can use JavaScript to power your menu instead. Or if you're using the CMS, it's probably already built in. A note on hover bubbling or propagation. If you have, of course, we have a hierarchy of elements, right? So if you have an element that has a hover, but it's within another element that also has a hover, you hover over the inner element. The inner element is within its parent, and so you're also hovering its parent. And it will trigger both hovers because they're both physically there at the time. Any child element, assuming it's not coded specially, it will be within its parent element. You can put it on the outside, which we'll get to with position, but normally it will be within its parent. And if you hover over the child that's within its parent, you are also hovering over a part of the parent, and you will trigger both of the hover effects, whatever they might be, whatever you've coded them to be. So if you just coded them to be maybe to change a background color, it will trigger both of those to change. Okay, so just be aware of it, make sure you're coding properly, and you shouldn't have anything to worry about. If you skip this last minute, you'll be surprised the next time you do it. Now on to position, our last topic, right? The default position, that's the first one I have here on the left, that's static. Every element so far that we have worked with, and we've never set position, they all are going to be static. That's the normal flow that we talked about. The elements are just going to be displayed by the browser in the normal flow. Static means it's not changing, nothing special is going on. Right? The next position is a relative position. So it takes that static position and allows us to make positional changes that are relative to its original static position, or what it would have been. So this green element is set to be relative, and it has an X and a Y value set. The X and Y values, when we talk about position, are always in the upper left-hand corner. Hopefully my camera is not reversed, the upper left-hand corner. So mathematically speaking, our computer screen is always in quadrant 4, with 0, 0 being in the upper left-hand corner. And when we talk about position relative, the upper left-hand corner is relative to its original position where it would have been if it were static. So this one, maybe it has one EM in the X and one EM on the Y, so it's pushed down. And because none of the other surrounding elements have their position changed, you do notice a bit of overlap down here. Right? If all the elements were position relative, we probably would not see this overlap because now they're all relatively positioned. But these blue ones are static, and in the first image here, the green one is also static. So this one is positioned relative to what it would have been if it were static. The next position we have is absolute. Now this one completely removes the element from the normal flow, does not leave space for it where it would have been. As you see in position relative, this third, or the second blue square, but this third square, it left space for the green element where it would have been if it were static, and then the blue one was just positioned in that spot. When the green one is positioned absolute, the other elements act as if the green one doesn't exist at all, and then they do their thing. They're positioned static, so they just come one after another, and then the green one is positioned again with an X and a Y value. It is positioned absolutely to the upper left corner of the first of its parent elements that have some position to be set. Okay, so if its parent element is also position absolute, this one will be absolute relative to that parent. If its parent element is positioned relative, this one will be absolutely positioned relative to that one. If none of its parent elements have any position set, this absolute positioning will be from the upper left corner of the body element. Okay, and then this last one is position fixed. Oh, a note about absolute is you can also push them completely outside of their parent as well. It doesn't quite show it over here, but once elements are absolutely positioned, they can be absolutely positioned 10,000 pixels away, completely off screen if you wanted to. Right? It will cause problems maybe, but you can do that. The fixed element, this one shows it being completely off screen here. It operates very much just like the absolute. Okay, and you can set that XY position where it's going to be. However, the fixed element, when the page initially loads, it gets its position, and then when the user scrolls, the fixed element does not move on the screen. It is fixed relative to the screen where it's at. This is very useful if you wanted to make some sort of a pop-up and you want the user to scroll behind the pop-up, but you don't want the pop-up to move. Now, this can be for a pop-up ad, or it can be for a pop-up menu, or anything that you want to do that. Or you can set things to be in the background that are fixed, and you can scroll in front of them. That's clever as well. Right? That's how position fixed works. Have some formal definition right here. Pause if you'd like to read those. And then we have some notes here, which I already talked about with the absolutely positioned as well. All right, so pause if you'd like to read that. Otherwise, that is the end of Chapter 6, page layout. Right? Thanks for watching.